and welcome to our final lesson dealing with the suit of swords in the minor arcana of the tarot. In the two previous lessons we've dealt with cards 1 ace through to 10, and in this final lesson we'll be dealing with the 4 court cards: page, knight, queen and king. So I have court cards from 3 different decks laid out here for this lesson. As always, I'm primarily working with the Rider-Waite, the Smith-Waite Tarot, drawn by Pamela Coleman Smith as our standard deck. But actually I will also be using court cards from this, which is a modern Golden Dawn based tarot. And finally, I'm also using these, which are court cards from the famous Crowley Thoth Tarot, painted by Lady Freda Harris. So the reason I have these 3 decks is because the courts as depicted in the Rider Tarot have more or less become the standard, and as I've said before, for beginners this is the best deck to start with. But I also want to show the variations that you can find in a number of, in different types of tarot deck. Each of these 3 decks deals with the courts in a different manner, so that will become apparent as we progress forward. Anyway, let's start with the page. We're starting at the foot of the court: the page, the servant, the messenger. In effect, as a servant figure, this figure carries no authority. He acts as a messenger under authority to those above him. So in practical terms, that is a symbol for us of youth, immaturity, the need to be guided. Pages in practical terms represent children or teenagers. They also represent us as adults, but when we're if we're in a phase of life where we're awakening to something, we're stepping into new territory, we're learning. Okay, so pages are always represented by the element of earth, but in this instance swords represent the element of air. So the page represents what we call in tarot terms earth of air. Now I'll use the Golden Dawn and the Thoth cards to kind of explain that first. I think probably actually I'll stick with the Thoth card because I think that explains it well. When Lady Freda Harris was describing her depiction of the Princess of Swords, which you can see here, the Thoth shows this figure as a princess rather than a page. So think of the princess as an envoy for the royal house, similarly a messenger. But she depicted the concept of the earthy part of air as a dust storm. So you can see the princess is kind of riding a dust storm, but you can see the sort of clouds of dust. So how does that relate to the page? The page, if you think of this being a young person or an emerging person in the realm of the sword, the realm of the mind, that becomes the archetypal student. Okay, so in the case of the princess, she has to cut her way through the dust storm to find clarity. Now that is in effect, you see something similar in the Golden Dawn card. The Golden Dawn princess again is very similar to the Thoth. That is what this young person is doing. That's what a student does. A student has to cut and sift their way through a bewildering range of knowledge to actually get to the truth. The page represents someone who is learning to think, who is learning to analyse, who is learning the difference between truth and untruth. Okay, The positive aspect of this page is somebody who wants to learn, who wants to seek the truth. So in real terms, this will be somebody who is innocent but earnest, somebody questioning. Now that can be child, teenager or adult, you know, somebody who's questioning, somebody who listens, you know, somebody who is eager to expand their horizons. Now, if we reverse him, we look at the negative aspect of this character. This is somebody who doesn't want to learn. This isn't somebody selfless who values the truth. This is somebody selfish who wants to remain in denial because actually that serves their selfish purposes. This is somebody who wants to be provided for rather than to make their own way in the world. This is somebody devious, you know. In a positive aspect, the sword cuts through to the truth. In a negative, dark aspect, the sword can be used to wound or harm. This is somebody, you know, in the negative, think back to your teens. You know, when we were all in that kind of selfish, narcissistic teenage stage, how often were we dishonest? How often were we sneaky? You know, it's, you know, maybe some of you weren't. I think most of us were. You know, it's kind of very often it's not a nice time to think back to. That's the negative aspect of this, you know. So if this turns up in a reading and, you know, you're dealing with the dark aspect, you know, you're dealing with somebody young or immature, is probably a better word. And that immaturity means that they can't be trusted because they're not being honest. If you're dealing with honest immaturity, you know, it's somebody who does want to be learned, somebody who, you know, can be guided. On a practical level, if this card appears in a reading, it could be pointing towards, you know, somebody bearing a message. It's like the ace. You know, the ace is a symbol of manifestations and new beginnings. When a page appears, it's the same kind of manifestation or new beginning, but it's more personified. It centers around an individual. So if that's the case in a reading, maybe you're looking at this and actually looking at individuals in your life and questioning, you know, what kind of expansions are they bringing to your horizons, you know? How many times have we had friends come into our lives and they broaden our horizons? Partners, you know? This guy turns up and he is getting you to look at the world in a different way. You know, he's just revealed something that made your world bigger, that made the horizons broader, you know, that made the foreign lands more important. So all of those things, but a new beginning, youth, innocence, freshness, but with potential dark sides. Similarly, actually, before we move on, similarly, if you reverse the Thoth card, she can't cut through the dust storm anymore. The dust storm actually conceals. So this is somebody that's potentially flailing around in the dark, you know? Okay, so we've looked at Earth of Air. If we move on to the Night, Nights are ruled by the element of air. So here is a figure that represents the pure qualities of air, the Knight of Swords. So in the Golden Dawn and the Thoth cards, knights are referred to as princes because they use a slightly different royal structure. But I would say that, you know, it's probably the meanings and the sentiments are probably similar. Actually, something that I didn't mention, let me just go back to the page. If you notice, the sword here is inclined to this person's left. It's inclined to the right on the card, but from his perspective, it would be inclined to the left. Now, Rachel Pollack talked about this, and it really made me think about, and also I think in Juliet Sharman Burke's Beginner's Guide to the Tarot, the direction of the sword is actually quite significant here, because to the left, you're leaning into the side of the subconscious and the feeling. So that shows symbolically that this page is somebody that is driven more by feelings than by rationale, hence the immaturity. With the Knight Knights are the next stage of maturity. So in real terms, you're talking somebody who has, this is not somebody who is fit to take authority, but they do have their beliefs and they are passionate about what they believe in and they can fight for it under the authority of somebody else. That's what a knight is. So with this person, I mean, you can see the knight on a very, very swiftly moving horse, feathers in his helmet to denote the element of air. You know, you almost get the sense there's a strong wind here because the clouds even look as if there's a strong wind. The trees are leaning forward in the blast of the wind. He's riding against the wind and into it. He's fighting against it. Symbols of air on the sort of, you know, the reins of the horse actually have butterflies on them, a very potent symbol of air. Yeah. What else can I say about this? The fastest of the knights, probably, you know, and the most single-minded because there's no clash of elements here. Knights are ruled by air. This is this is the knight riding through the element of air, and he is air himself. So this is actually, in his positive aspect, this is pure truth. You know, this is somebody who cuts through to the truth and fights for the truth. Not necessarily the most feeling or compassionate of people. You know, sometimes the truth is more important than, you know, than the people around him. You know, so in the pursuit of truth, a few people might get hurt. Sometimes that's a good thing. Sometimes it's a bad thing. This really is the knight, you know, the crusader, the knight in shining armour fighting for truth, you know, fighting for justice. Actually quite a formidable figure. You wouldn't want to cross this figure in combat because actually the speed that he moves and with the zeal that he fights for what he believes in, because air is a very swift moving element. Yeah, very formidable. The champion is actually, you know, this is the archetypal champion, the archetypal winner. So actually, if he appears in a reading, you know, that's kind of drawing you to your own personal victories and your own justifiable victories, you know. If you reverse it, take the scruples away. You know, he doesn't slow down. He doesn't become any less idealistic. He just becomes a lot less honest and a lot crueler. You know, the cruelty of the sword, you know, the sword of conflict rather than the sword of justice becomes emphasized when this card is reversed. Reversed, this is to me, this is a very frightening figure because people don't matter. Truth doesn't matter. All that matters is winning, which makes him very dangerous. And I think it does point us to the destructive people in our lives who have to win at any cost when it appears in its negative aspect. So yeah, the champion, the knight in shining armour, the overpowering opponent who is, quite frankly, you know, you're not likely to win if you're pitched against this one. Okay. So let's just have a quick look. Interestingly enough, I think the symbolism on the Golden Dawn prince is very similar to the symbolism on the Thoth deck. You see his chariot being drawn what looks like kind of winged messengers or fae folk. Yeah, it's interesting that you have human figures enslaved to draw the chariot on that one. It comes across even more on, I think the dark aspect of the Prince Knight comes through on the Thoth, because you can see these three figures rein to the chariot and drawing him along, but actually to me it looks as if it's also his sword is raised against them. You know, you can imagine this knight really yielding the whip relentlessly to flog the chariot along. So, you know, that's my subjective interpretation of this Thoth card. You know, I'm not a Thoth expert. read Crowley and Lady Freda Harris's depictions here. That will probably tell you a little bit more. I tend to view this as you reverse it, it kind of blunts his malignant influence, you know. I think for me, the Thoth card, it feels negative upright and a little bit more positive reversed, you know. Whenever this appears, even if I'm not using reversals, it kind of gets me to look at maybe the Jekyll and Hyde aspect of the Knight, you know, how the quest for justice could very easily spill over into the quest for cruelty, sometimes, you know, without you even realising. So, okay, moving on to the Queen. Queens take us into the realm of water. So in this case, we're dealing with water of air. And that, I find that sometimes a little bit difficult to come to, you know, to come to terms with. But I tend to think of this as, the clouds. I think of water vapor in the clouds. So when I think of the clouds, I think of somebody who is rising above, and somebody who's looking down on the conflict. And that kind of fits, to me, that fits the concept. Let's have a look at the Queen anyway. If you look at her throne, on the side of her throne there are butterflies and a winged cherub. Now, wings, again, it kind of emphasises the rising above. She has a crown of butterflies, which says to me that her mind rises above. And obviously water vapour rises in the atmosphere, and that's what forms clouds. One very interesting symbol on this. Look at her left wrist. So left depicting the unconscious and the seat of the feelings. It shows a tassel around her wrist that's been cut. Many people take this as a symbol of divorce. That's kind of how I view it. She is holding her sword virtually upright. So there is a real balance here between the emotions and rational thinking. Now, if you look back at the early fortune-telling interpretations of the Queen of Swords, she was known as the Widow or the Black Widow, or she was seen as the archetypal divorcee, hence the severed tassel. I still see her like that. I think a lot of modern tarot readers do. This is someone... Water is the realm of feelings, air is the realm of the mind. This is someone who can marry the two successfully. I think this is somebody who has had very bitter experiences, hence the cut tassel. But you can see even on her cloak is covered in clouds. So that shows, again, the cloak shows the water of the feelings rising into the air, rising above. This, to me, if you think of a divorcee, someone who's been through the pain of relationship conflict, the pain of battle, the pain of separation and breakup, the pain of divorce, maybe the pain of widowhood. Once you've been through that kind of experience, it really does temper you. You mature through it. You mature at a cost. Maybe at the cost we saw in the 9 and the 10 of Swords. So with bitter experience, you don't take prisoners anymore. And actually, this is the essence of this figure. She has learned her wisdom and her authority as a queen, her maturity, and that gives her the authority to rule, has been bought at a cost. And as a result, she has emotional resilience, mental maturity, and she is fully acquainted with the power of grief. Once you've been through that, you don't take prisoners. You don't cut the crap. You don't hide behind niceties. You say it as it is. So if she appears in a reading, she's wise, but she's not comfortable to be around. You know, as a queen, she has a caring and nurturing and benevolent aspect, but that caring aspect comes out through her being quite happy to face you with the uncomfortable truth, whether you like it or not. If she knows the uncomfortable truth is going to be good for you, she'll tell it. that doesn't make her easy to be around. And how many people have we met like that? You know, they are scary, but they're worth their weight in gold. We don't like what they're telling us when they say it. We'll fight against it initially, but ultimately we know they're right, you know? And that's what makes her such a powerful figure. That's why her sword is upright. You know, there's a balance between the head and the heart in this woman, and it's been bought at a very high cost. So if she turns up in a reading, maybe we've got to get real with ourselves. Maybe we've got to listen to someone who is getting real with us. We turn her upside down, we're into some really not nice territory, because this is somebody who's not worked through the pain, not worked through the grief, not learnt to forgive, or not, if not forgive, at least not come to terms with the injustice that's been done to her. She is living from a place of damage. She is the victim of cruelty who has learnt to be cruel to protect herself. So if we're facing this figure in a dark aspect, it's somebody who is very dangerous. That's the danger of a sword, when it's actually not being used for the good. Now, in the hands of somebody in authority, it becomes very, very destructive indeed. So, yeah, we've got somebody bitter, twisted, cruel, and somebody who actually at the heart of it is very vulnerable still. So when we come across this figure, both in readings and in our own lives, you know, you tread with care, you tread with caution. You probably put boundaries around to protect yourself, and in some cases you avoid. But then we kind of need to be compassionate towards these kind of people in our lives, because at the heart of it, they're not as tough as they look, you know, and sometimes that can be a really uncomfortable. If this is a mirror, it's a very uncomfortable mirror, you know, and if we see ourselves in this reverse figure, then we've got a lot of questions to ask. So, okay, it shows in the Golden Dawn card and in the Thoth, again, which are very similar. I think there is probably inspiration from the biblical tale of Judith and Holofernes. The Queen is shown holding a severed head, a severed male head. Very similar in the Thoth, but again, it's kind of more elemental. You see her rising up in the sky on the clouds. So I find this card actually very frightening, because who wants to approach a woman like this? You know, even if she is telling the truth, that could actually, you know, do us a lot of good, you know. Now, this doesn't have to be a woman. It could be a man or a woman. But, yeah. Truth hurts. When we walk away from truth, there's a lot of cruelty implied here. You know, that sword, if you know, anyone who's given a sword like that as a, you know, as a tool of authority, you know, and you know, as a tool of power, it has to be used responsibly. So if you think of this person as, you know, somebody in authority in a workplace, you know, if they're coming from a good place, they are actually very constructive, albeit uncomfortable. If they're coming from a bad place, we have a tyrant boss, you know. In relationships, that could potentially be even more destructive. Okay, so that's the Queen. Finally, moving to the King. Kings were into the realm of fire, but at the same time, this is the realm of air. Fire and air is a very, very potent combination. You know, flames whipped along by gale force winds are potentially the most destructive force on, you know, one of the most destructive forces on the planet. I mean, you know, particularly if you think of raging wildfires, you know, in tropical and subtropical regions, say no more. I would say that's the negative aspect of this king. In his positive aspect, as a king, an authority figure, it's his passion that fuels him, the passion of fire, because it's that passion that actually fuels his sense of justice. But at the same time, as a king, he's responsible and mature enough to keep it in check. You know, and that's what an authority, you know, a genuine, healthy authority figure does. Similar to the Queen, his throne, shows butterflies, but interestingly as well, it also shows a waxing and a waning moon surrounding the top butterfly. So to me, that symbolises actually a completed phase. So if we tied that in with his sword of justice and this sword of authority, I would say that that symbolises that the butterfly symbolises the flight of the mind. The moons symbolise complete, actually going through the whole thought process before actually making your decisions. Interestingly, if you look at his crown is fronted by a winged cherub, again showing the flight of the mind. The sword is actually inclined to his right, which means that he is very definitely favouring the rational balance above the emotions. Now, in a position of kingship, he has to act justly. Now, justice very often requires stepping back and being dispassionate, which I think is quite interesting with the inclination of the sword there. It looks to me as if he is on top of a hill, possibly. You're looking up to him, I would say. Again, clouds, seagulls, there's a sense of him being in a high place anyway. So, fire of air. Somebody who has passion, but that passion is a belief in justice, So this is the archetypal lawmaker, lawgiver, and somebody who reigns and wants to create a kingdom that is founded on truth. Very powerful, just figure. Reversed, the passion of fire is allowed to spill over. Justice doesn't matter so much anymore. This is the archetypal tyrant, the archetypal dictator, where justice is supplanted by the need to control, the lust for power. Justice becomes what suits the state, not what benefits every member of the state. This is where the state works for itself at the expense of the people. So if he appears upright in a reading, we're dealing with, with authority figures. I think if he appears, actually, you're kind of dealing with how you handle authority, or how authority is affecting you. If we're not looking inward to question our own motives, we're looking outward at actually what kind of environment we're in. So it's very much going to depend where in the reading he appears. Is this good, constructive authority that builds people up? Or does it tear people down for personal gain? Is it benevolent authority? Is it cruel authority? And again, maybe we've got to ask those questions of ourselves. When we're put in positions of authority, just how objective are we being? And how benevolent are we being? How just are we being? So there we have it. That is our journey through the Suit of Swords. And in the next lesson, we will be looking at the Suit of Cups. If you've enjoyed this lesson and found it helpful, please hit the like button, share it with your friends, and subscribe to my channel to find out when I share new videos or go live. You can also find me on Instagram at Chris Butler Artist, on Twitter at Butler Tarot, and on Facebook at The Sacred Tarot. Thanks for watching, and see you next time.